The cake was a lemon chantilly from a bakery on 4th Street that didn't take walk-ins. It cost $140, and the icing was perfectly smooth, undisturbed by even a single candle. I hadn't lit them yet. I was still holding the silver lighter in my right hand when Mark sat down across from me in our designer living room. The room smelled of expensive leather and Joe Malone candles. The lighting was recessed, dim, and calculated to make the $40,000 worth of Italian furniture look like an art gallery. Mark didn't look at the cake. He didn't look at the gift I had wrapped in heavy, cream-colored paper. He looked at the floor, then at the vaulted ceiling, and finally at me. "I'm falling out of love, Sarah," he said. His voice was steady, practiced. He had rehearsed this in his head, likely during his 40-minute commute in the Audi I paid the note on. "I think we both knew this was coming. You've become difficult, too emotional. Every conversation we have is a conflict, and frankly, I dread being in the same room as you." I didn't blink. I didn't drop the lighter. I watched a small bead of condensation slide down the side of my champagne flute. "It's inevitable," he continued, gaining confidence from my silence. "We've grown apart. I want 50-50 custody of the kids, all 3 of them. We'll sell the house, split the equity, and move on like adults." The mention of our eldest son, Leo, didn't make my hand shake. Leo was 3 miles away in a sterile hospital wing, his body ravaged by a courageous battle with stage 3 neuroblastoma. Mark was sitting in a temperature-controlled room, complaining about his dread, while our son was hooked to a morphine drip. "You want to sell the house?" I asked. My voice was a flat line. "It's the only way to be fair, Sarah. I need my half to start my new life. I can't be held back by your instability anymore." He thought he was looking at a woman about to shatter. He thought the silence was me absorbing the blow of his rejection. He was wrong. The silence wasn't grief. It was the sound of a system rebooting. I wasn't feeling. I was auditing. I was thinking about the 1.2% interest rate on our mortgage, the post-nuptial agreement sitting in my safe deposit box, and the 12,000 gigabytes of data my private investigator had uploaded to a secure cloud server 3 hours ago. "I see," I said. 10 minutes. 10 minutes for what? Mark asked, frowning. "For me to finish my cake," I replied. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I took a bite of the lemon chantilly. It was tart, cold, and expensive. Mark watched me, his brows furrowed in a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to scream, to throw a crystal flute, to beg him to reconsider for the sake of the children. He wanted the ego boost of my devastation. But I am a surgical consultant. My entire professional life is built on the foundation of remaining calm while things are bleeding out in front of me. In the OR, panic is a death sentence. In a divorce, it's a financial one. "You're being cold, Sarah," he said, leaning back into the leather armchair. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're like a machine. No wonder the spark died. You don't even care that our marriage is ending." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the slight puffiness under his eyes from a life of moderate effort and high-end scotch. I saw the $1,200 suit that I had picked out for his promotion party. To him, I was a machine. To me, he was a variable that had become a liability. The spark hadn't died. It had been systematically extinguished by a year of my 80-hour work weeks while he played house with a mistress. He mistook my exhaustion for instability and my focus on our son's survival as emotional distance. I felt a click in the back of my mind. It's a physical sensation I get before a difficult procedure, a moment of absolute, freezing clarity. The man sitting across from me wasn't my partner. He wasn't the father of my children. He was an intruder in a house he didn't earn, threatening the stability of a sick child he barely visited. I care about facts, Mark, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And the fact is, you've made your decision. Now I have to make mine. He smirked, thinking he had won the negotiation before it even started. He had no idea that while he was falling out of love, I was falling into a deep, clinical interest in his destruction. To understand how we got to this designer living room, you have to understand the math. Mark liked to talk about our success, but the reality was written in black and white on our joint tax returns. As a high-level surgical consultant, I bill $450 an hour. My base salary, plus performance bonuses and equity stakes in the private clinics I optimize, puts my annual income north of $650,000. Mark is a mid-level director at a logistics firm. He makes $115,000. For the last 8 years, I have been the engine. I paid the $180,000 down payment on this house. I paid for the private schools. I paid for the Audi, the vacations to Turks and Caicos, and the $15,000 custom cabinetry in the kitchen he currently uses to pour his morning coffee. I didn't mind. I thought we were a team. I thought my 12-hour shifts were the price I paid to give my children a legacy. I was grateful when Mark started working late a year ago. I told him I appreciated his hard work for the family. I even felt guilty that my career was so demanding, often leaving him to handle the evening routines. But the routine had changed after Leo's diagnosis. When the doctors told us our 6-year-old had a tumor the size of a grapefruit, the world stopped for me. I scaled back my consulting hours just enough to live in the pediatric oncology ward. I learned the names of every nurse. I memorized the side effects of vincristine and cyclophosphamide. Mark, however, seemed to get busier. "I have to pick up the slack, Sarah," he'd say, kissing my forehead as I prepared to spend another night on a pull-out chair in room 402. "Someone has to keep the career side of things moving while you focus on Leo." I believed him. I was so blinded by the trauma of my son's hair falling out in clumps that I didn't question the $400 dinner charges at the Capitol Grill that started appearing on our secondary credit card. I didn't question why he was suddenly buying new silk ties and expensive cologne. I was funding his working late. I was paying for the gas that drove him to her apartment. I was paying for the hotel rooms where they laughed about how clueless I was. "She's so in the weeds with the kid, she won't even notice," his mistress, a 24-year-old junior analyst named Chloe, had texted him. I knew this because I had hired a firm that specializes in digital forensics the moment I noticed a $2,500 charge at a jewelry store I'd never entered. The breakdown of my financial support over the last 12 months was staggering. $42,000 in business travel that was actually weekend getaways with Chloe. $12,000 in gifts, including a Chanel bag I found hidden in his trunk. $8,500 in client entertainment that consisted of 5-star dinners for 2. He was a parasite who had convinced himself he was the host. He walked around our neighborhood with his chest out, the successful husband of a prominent consultant, while he was effectively on my payroll. He thought his $115,000 salary made him a provider. He didn't realize that in the world I built, $115,000 is barely enough to cover the property taxes and the landscaping. The pattern of abuse wasn't physical. It was the slow, steady exploitation of my labor and my heart during the darkest year of my life. He didn't just step out on our marriage. He stepped out on our family when we were at our most vulnerable. He used my money to buy the time and the resources to replace me. But he forgot one very important thing. In my world, if you don't produce a return on investment, you get liquidated. People ask why women like me, Women who analyze risk for a living stay in situations that are clearly failing. The answer isn't love. It's the sunk cost fallacy. I had invested 15 years into Mark. I had invested 3 children, a 1.2% mortgage, and a decade of shared holidays. I treated my marriage like a long-term portfolio. I figured if I just put in more sweat equity, the market would eventually correct itself. Mark knew this. He relied on it. He used a psychological tactic called intermittent reinforcement. One day, he'd be the doting father, bringing coffee to the hospital at 6 a.m. The next, he was the cold, distant stranger who made me feel like my grief for our son was a personal attack on his happiness. I was being conditioned to accept less, to be grateful for the crumbs of his attention while I provided the entire loaf of our existence. He made me feel difficult for asking where he was, and emotional for crying in the shower when Leo's white blood cell count plummeted. He positioned himself as the stable one because he wasn't in the trenches of the illness. He was the cool parent, the one who took the other 2 kids for ice cream while I handled the vomiting and the PICC line cleanings. He was building a narrative where I was the broken, unstable mother, and he was the stoic, suffering husband. It was a brilliant bit of gaslighting. If he could convince me that I was the problem, I wouldn't look too closely at him. If I was the emotional one, then his coldness wasn't a red flag. It was a rational response to my instability. He needed me to stay in the scapegoat role so he could keep playing the golden provider. But conditioning only works as long as the subject remains in the dark. The moment of cold clarity didn't come from a lipstick stain or a late-night text. It came from a digital folder labeled chemo in our shared cloud drive. I thought it was medical records. I thought it was Mark finally taking an interest in Leo's treatment plan. I opened the first file. It was a photo. It was a selfie Mark had taken in Leo's room at the children's hospital. In the foreground, Mark was smirking, his hair perfectly coiffed. In the background, our 6-year-old son lay curled in a ball, his skin a sickly, translucent yellow, his head bald, clutching a stuffed dinosaur. The caption on the metadata, sent via an encrypted app to Chloe, read, "Stuck in the depressing room again. The vibe here is killing my soul. Can't wait to be back in your bed tonight where it's warm. Miss your skin." I felt the blood leave my face, not because I was sad, because I was disgusted. I scrolled. There were more. Photos of Leo's monitors while he was having a reaction to the chemo, sent to Chloe with comments about how Sarah was losing her mind again, and how he needed a real woman to distract him. There were nudes Chloe had sent him while we were sitting in the consultation room hearing about 5-year survival rates. Mark had used our son's fight for his life as a backdrop for his midlife crisis. He had used Leo's suffering to garner sympathy points from a 20-something mistress who thought he was a warrior dad struggling with an unstable wife. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for exactly 22 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a door in my mind lock, and I knew that Mark, the man I thought I knew, was effectively dead to me. I didn't see a husband anymore. I saw a biohazard. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call a therapist. I called my attorney, a man who charges $800 an hour and specializes in high-conflict asset protection. "I need a forensic audit of every account Mark has touched in the last 24 months, I told him, "and find the postnup we signed in 2018, the Aurora Clause. I want to know if his behavior triggers the infidelity penalty." "It's a steep hill to climb, Sarah," my attorney warned. "I'm a surgeon," I replied. "I know exactly where to cut." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in clinical efficiency. While Mark spent his time negotiating the terms of our separation, mostly focusing on how much of the $1.4 million in home equity he could pocket to impress Chloe, I was building a fortress. I opened my laptop at 2 a.m. and created a spreadsheet titled Project Solvent. It wasn't about the marriage. It was about the extraction of a parasite. First, I pulled the postnuptial agreement from 2018. We had signed it after I received a substantial inheritance from my grandmother, money that served as the down payment for our home. At the time, Mark had signed it with a shrug, calling it just paperwork, because he never expected me to actually use it. The Aurora Clause was tucked into Section 9.4. It stated that, in the event of documented infidelity, the non-offending spouse retained 100% ownership of any assets purchased with inherited funds, regardless of commingling. I checked the timestamps on the PI reports. I had 14 separate instances of him entering Chloe's apartment, corroborated by credit card receipts for Uber Black rides I had unknowingly subsidized. Next, I looked at the credit scores. Mark had been quietly trying to tank mine by forgetting to pay the utility bills that were in my name, despite me transferring him the funds monthly. He wanted me to have a meh score so I couldn't refinance the house alone. He wanted me to be forced to sell. He didn't know I had a private line of credit he couldn't see. I spent 4 hours on the phone with my bank's private wealth manager, moving $300,000, funds my parents had been holding in a dormant trust, into a liquid account under my sole control. I then performed a deep dive into his professional life. Mark worked for a firm that prided itself on family values and ethical leadership. I discovered that he had used the company's corporate account to book client dinners that were actually dates with Chloe. He had even listed her as a consultant on a minor project to justify her presence at a regional conference. That wasn't just an affair, that was corporate fraud. I printed every hotel receipt, every selfie from the chemo room, every text message where he called me unstable to justify his theft. I organized them into 3 distinct packets. Packet 1, the legal reality, post-nup, bank records, and the divorce filing. Packet 2, the social reality, the evidence for Chloe's husband. Packet 3, the professional reality, the HR ethics report. By the time the sun rose, I had the exact numbers. Mark thought he was walking away with $700,000 in equity and a fresh start. In reality, he was looking at a net worth of 0, a potential lawsuit from his employer, and a total loss of the status he had spent a decade stealing from me. Execution is about timing. It's about ensuring the pressure is applied to all points of the wound simultaneously so the patient can't recover. Wednesday, 9 a.m. I sent the first email. It was to Chloe's husband, a man named David who worked in finance and had no idea his wife was mentoring my husband in hotel rooms. I didn't include a long letter. I just attached the folder of photos and the credit card statements, showing Mark had paid for her $800 spa day last month. Wednesday, 10:30 a.m. I dropped a physical courier pack at Mark's HR department. It was addressed to the Chief Ethics Officer. It contained the itemized list of corporate expenses Mark had billed for personal trysts. I knew their policy. Misappropriation of funds was an immediate termination offense. Wednesday, 12 p.m. I called the locksmith. I need the internal suite and the primary bedroom locks changed, I told him. And I need the external codes reset. I have the legal deed showing sole ownership. I didn't do this with a shaking hand. I did it while eating a salad at my desk between patient consultations. Throughout the day, I watched the Family Circle app on my phone. I saw Mark's icon at his office. Then I saw it move to a nearby bar. Then back to the office. He was likely getting the first confused texts from Chloe as David confronted her. I didn't respond to any of Mark's checking in texts. I didn't answer his calls. I let the silence build. Silence is a vacuum. It forces the other person to fill it with their own anxiety. By 4 p.m., I received a notification from my bank. The $300,000 from the trust had cleared. I immediately initiated a buyout process for the small portion of the home's improvement value that Mark could technically claim, effectively neutralizing his argument for a forced sale. I then sent one final message to our shared calendar. It was an appointment set for 6 p.m. that evening in the foyer. The title: Asset Finalization. Mark replied within seconds. Finally. I'm glad you're being adult about this, Sarah. We can split the house money and both get a fresh start. See you then. He actually thought he was winning. He thought he was coming home to collect a check. I stood in the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I looked at the clock. The 10 minutes I had given him to finish his cake 2 days ago had officially expired. Now, it was time for the surgery. The first crack in Mark's composure didn't come from me. It came from his phone. I was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through Leo's latest labs, when I heard the heavy thud of the front door. Mark walked in, looking energized. He had that new life glow, the kind a man gets when he thinks he's successfully traded in a boring responsibility for a consequence-free fantasy. "Glad you're home," he said, tossing his keys on the marble island, the island I paid for. "I've been looking at some lofts downtown. If we list the house by Monday, we can probably—" His phone chirped, a sharp, insistent vibration against the stone. He glanced at it. His expression shifted from arrogance to confusion. Then his phone chirped again, and again. A rapid-fire succession of notifications that sounded like a warning siren. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice as flat as a dial tone. It's Chloe," he muttered, his thumb flying across the screen. "She's panicking. She says her husband just cleared out their joint savings and left with their kids. She says he knows everything." He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of surprise. He found nothing. "Sarah, did you—" Before he could finish, his phone rang. It was his boss. Mark's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew that a call from the managing director at 6:15 p.m. on a Wednesday only meant one thing. "Answer it, Mark," I said. "You've always been so dedicated to your late nights. Don't keep them waiting." He stepped into the foyer, his hands shaking as he pressed the phone to his ear. I stayed in the kitchen, listening to the one-sided carnage. "Yes, sir. No, I can explain. The dinners were— I have receipts. Sir?" The silence that followed was heavy. He pulled the phone away and stared at the screen. "They suspended me," he whispered, turning back to face me. "Pending a full forensic audit of my expense reports. They said corporate ethics violations." "Sarah, what the hell did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Mark. I simply stopped subsidizing your lies. I provided the documentation you created. If the truth is damaging to your career, perhaps you should have been more careful with the facts." "You're ruining me," he shouted, stepping toward me. "This is exactly why I'm leaving. You're vindictive. You're trying to take everything because you're jealous." I stood up slowly. I am 5 feet 8 inches, but in that moment, I felt like a giant looking down at a microscopic organism. "Jealous of what, Mark? The studio apartment you're about to move into? The mistress who is currently being served divorce papers? Or the fact that you've spent the last year documented on high-definition video acting like a teenager while your son fought for his life?" The mention of the video stopped him cold. The rage in his eyes flickered out, replaced by a raw, jagged fear. He realized for the first time that this wasn't a domestic argument. This was a liquidation. Mark stood in the foyer, the space between us feeling like a vast, icy canyon. He tried to reclaim his posture, straightening the lapels of the suit I had bought him. He reached for the emotional card one last time, the weapon he had used to keep me compliant for years. "You're having a breakdown, Sarah," he said, his voice cracking with a desperate attempt at authority. "You're acting out of spite. When you calm down, you'll realize that we need to sell this house to survive. You can't afford this lifestyle without my contribution." I didn't laugh. That would be an emotional response. Instead, I picked up the heavy manila envelope resting on the console table and slid it across the marble toward him. "Your contribution, Mark, is $115,000 gross. My contribution is $650,000. My lifestyle is something I own. Yours was a guest pass that just expired." He ripped open the envelope. I watched his eyes dart across the pages. He skipped the divorce filing and went straight to the property addendum. "The postnup?" he stammered. "That was from years ago. It's not valid. We've lived here for 6 years. It's marital property." "Read section 9.4 again," I said. "The Aurora Clause. You signed it in front of a notary. It specifies that any asset purchased with my inheritance remains separate property in the event of infidelity. I have the bank trail showing the down payment came from my grandmother's trust. And I have the PI reports with timestamps showing you and Chloe's apartment while I was at the hospital. You can't prove infidelity just because I was at a friend's house. I don't have to prove it to you, Mark. I've already proven it to the court. And I have the selfies." He froze. The mention of the photos acted like a physical blow. "The ones from the chemo room," I continued, stepping into the foyer. "The ones where you were texting Chloe about how depressing our son's cancer was while he was sleeping 3 feet away from you. My attorney calls that egregious conduct. A judge will call it a reason to grant me sole legal and physical custody with supervised visitation." "You wouldn't," he whispered. "They're my kids, too." "They were your kids when they needed a father. They were your kids when Leo needed you to hold his hand instead of your phone. But you chose to be a cool guy with a mistress instead. You don't get to be a part-time parent and a full-time predator." Mark looked around the foyer, his eyes landing on the luxury finishes, the art, the life he had occupied like a squatter. "Where am I supposed to go? I have no money, Sarah. My accounts are frozen." "Not my problem. Your credit cards, the ones where I was the primary card holder, have been canceled. Your access to the joint savings has been revoked pending the audit. I've already had the locks changed on the internal suite. Your things are in the garage." "The garage?" He looked horrified. "Sarah, be reasonable. It's my birthday tomorrow." "And it was mine yesterday," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the air. "You chose my birthday to tell me you were dreading being in the room with me? You chose my birthday to try and take half the equity I earned while I was saving our son's life. You wanted a fresh start, Mark. Here it is." I checked my watch. "It's 6:42 p.m. In 8 minutes, the security service I hired will be here to escort you off the property. You have 10 minutes to pack a bag from the garage. I suggest you start with the suit. You'll need it for your HR hearing tomorrow." "Sarah, please," he started, his voice finally breaking into a sob. He reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just the quiet relief of a successful surgery. The tumor was out. 7 minutes, Mark. He stood there for a moment, a hollowed-out version of the man who had walked in 10 minutes earlier. He realized there was no negotiation. There was no gaslighting his way out of a forensic audit. He turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked toward the door to the garage. He stopped at the threshold and looked back. You're a monster." "No, Mark," I said, leaning against the wall of the home I owned. "I'm a consultant, and I just finished my final report on you." I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The click was the most satisfying sound I had heard in 15 years. 6 months later, the dust didn't just settle, it was swept away. Mark is currently living in a 450 square foot studio apartment in a part of the city he used to call beneath him. He lost his job 3 weeks after the confrontation. The corporate audit found $14,000 in misappropriated funds. He wasn't prosecuted, but he was blacklisted from every major logistics firm in the tri-state area. He's currently working as a consultant for a small shipping warehouse, making less than half of his previous salary. Chloe didn't stick around for the fresh start. Once her husband David filed for divorce and cut off her access to their marital assets, she realized that a disgraced, unemployed Mark wasn't nearly as thrilling as a successful married one. They broke up over a series of screaming texts that I have saved in a folder, just in case. My home remains quiet, stable, and mine. The 1.2% interest rate is a constant reminder that patience and preparation pay off. Leo's latest scan came back clear. He's in remission. The hair is growing back, thick and dark, just like mine. We spent last Saturday at the park, and for the first time in a year, I didn't check my watch to see when Mark was getting off work. I didn't have to manage someone else's ego or apologize for being too emotional about my son's health. I didn't lose 10 pounds from the divorce diet. I lost 180 pounds of dead weight that had been dragging my family toward a cliff. I see Mark once every 2 weeks for supervised visitation at a neutral facility. He looks older. The Audi was repossessed, and he shows up in a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield. He tries to make small talk, but I don't engage. We don't have conflicts anymore because I no longer recognize him as a person capable of conflicting with me. He is simply a biological fact I have to manage until the children turn 18. People ask me if I feel guilty for ruining him. I tell them the same thing I tell my residents. You don't blame the surgeon for removing the cancer. You thank them for saving the patient. I didn't ruin Mark. I just stopped holding up the sky for a man who was busy trying to sell the ground from under my feet. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a home where everyone is safe. It's not the heavy, suffocating silence of walking on eggshells, or the ringing silence that follows a screaming match. It's the sound of a system running at 100% efficiency. I learned that being emotional isn't a weakness. It's an early warning system. Mark tried to use my humanity against me, thinking that my love for my children and my dedication to my marriage made me soft. He mistook my endurance for blindness. He forgot that the same hands that can comfort a sick child are the ones trained to hold a scalpel with unwavering precision. If you are in the trenches right now, whether it's a medical battle, a professional war, or a betrayal that makes you feel like the air has been sucked out of the room, remember this. Clarity is your greatest weapon. You don't need to scream to be heard, and you don't need to move fast to win. You just need to be the person who owns the documentation. They will call you cold when they can no longer manipulate your warmth. They will call you calculated when they realize they can no longer afford your grace. Let them. The view from the high ground is much better when you aren't carrying a parasite on your back. If you've ever had to become the villain in someone else's story just to survive your own, hit that like button and share this story. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a moment of clarity that changed everything? And don't forget to subscribe. We're building something real here. I'm Sarah. I'm a surgeon, a mother, and a survivor. And for the first time in 15 years, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be.